When we ask the Father to teach us to live like Jesus, the very first reality that confronts us is obedience. Not obedience as a shallow duty or mechanical rule-keeping, but obedience as the deep anchor of the heart. If you study the life of Jesus, you cannot miss it. His entire existence was one continuous act of submission to the Father's will. He himself said, "I did not come to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." That single statement unmasks the central lie of our age, the lie that life is about self-definition, self-expression, and self-fulfillment. Christ's life shows us that true freedom is not found in casting off God's commands, but in aligning ourselves with them completely. The modern heart resists this. We are told from the time we are young that our feelings, desires, and ambitions are sovereign. We are taught to build identities around what pleases us, not what pleases God. And yet, if you look honestly at the outcome of such living, it leads not to wholeness, but to fragmentation. People who chase their own will end up slaves to it, bound by addictions, consumed by anxiety, driven by a relentless hunger that nothing in this world can satisfy. Jesus shows us another way. His obedience was not reluctant compliance, it was joyful surrender. The difference is crucial. Obedience without joy is drudgery, but obedience rooted in love for the Father is liberation. Now, let's be honest, submission grates against our pride. We want control. We want to determine the course of our lives. Even our prayers often betray this. We don't come asking, "Father, teach me to do your will," but "Father, bless what I've already decided I want." That is not Christlike prayer. That is merely asking God to serve our self-will. To live like Jesus today is to invert that impulse to pray with the humility of Gethsemane. "Not my will, but yours be done." That prayer is not merely for the crisis moments of life. It is the posture we are to carry into every ordinary decision of every ordinary day. But let's press deeper. What makes obedience so hard? Philosophically, it is because our wills are disordered. The human heart is not neutral ground, it is tilted toward rebellion. That's why obedience to God feels unnatural to the unredeemed man. It takes the Spirit of God renewing the mind, softening the heart, and reordering the desires before obedience can become delight. Psychologically, we resist because obedience feels like loss. It feels like we're being asked to give up something, our freedom, our autonomy, our happiness. But the truth is that every act of disobedience to God enslaves us further, while every act of obedience breaks chains. What looks like loss is actually gain, because what we relinquish is slavery to self, and what we receive is fellowship with the Father. Jesus modeled this perfectly. He obeyed not because the Father's will was always easy, but because it was always good. Even when obedience led him to betrayal, mockery, and death, he did not waver. Why? Because he trusted the Father's character more than the appearance of his circumstances. That is the test for us as well. Will you trust the Father when obedience costs you reputation, comfort, or success? Will you cling to his will when the world calls you foolish for it? To live like Jesus is to answer those questions with your life, not just your lips. Now notice something else. Obedience is not passive. It is not simply the absence of rebellion, but the active pursuit of the Father's will. Jesus was not neutral, he was intentional. He rose early to pray. He engaged with people who others ignored. He spoke truth even when it provoked hostility. His obedience was lived out in action, not merely in theory. This is where many of us fall short. We think obedience is only about avoiding sin, but it is also about doing the good we are commanded to do. To refuse compassion when the Spirit prompts, to withhold forgiveness when it is required, to remain silent when truth must be spoken. That too is disobedience. So then the call is not to a reluctant conformity, but to a radical reorientation of the heart. Ask yourself, is my life built around my will or his? Does my daily routine, my work, my conversations, my use of time reflect surrender to the Father's purposes? Or is obedience something I only think about when it collides with what I want? These are not abstract questions. They are the very measure of whether we are living as disciples or merely as admirers of Christ. And here is the mystery when the Father teaches you to obey. When you truly begin to anchor your heart in his will, you discover a joy that cannot be explained in worldly terms. It is the quiet strength of knowing you are where you ought to be. It is the peace of walking in harmony with the very God who designed you. It is the freedom of no longer being mastered by your own unstable emotions, but instead being steadied by his unchanging word. So when you rise tomorrow morning, don't just ask God to bless your plans. Ask him to dismantle them if they stand in the way of his. Ask him to give you a heart that loves obedience more than ease, that treasures his will more than applause, and that finds its freedom not in doing whatever it wants, but in doing what he commands. That is the way Jesus lived, and it is the way we are called to live if we are to bear his name with integrity. Because at the end of the day, obedience is not merely about rules. It is about relationship. To obey is to love, to trust, to submit to the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. And until obedience becomes the anchor of our hearts, we cannot truly say we are walking as Jesus walked. So I leave you with this. If you want to live like Christ today, then begin here. Make obedience the non-negotiable center of your life. For in surrender you will find freedom, in yielding you will find strength, and in obedience you will finally discover what it means to truly live. If obedience is the anchor of the heart, then love is the very pulse that animates it. To live like Jesus today is to live a life saturated with compassion and selfless love. And this is not sentimental or superficial. It is profound, costly, and countercultural. The life of Christ cannot be understood apart from his love. Every miracle, every act of service, every confrontation with hypocrisy was rooted in a heart that consistently gave itself away for the good of others and the glory of the Father. And that is the life we are asking God to form in us when we pray, Father, teach me to live like Jesus today. Yet here lies the tension. The love of Christ is radically different from what our age calls love. Today, love is often reduced to tolerance, affirmation, or fleeting affection. It is sentimentalized into emotion, stripped of truth, or weaponized into self-interest. But Jesus demonstrated something far deeper, a love that was patient and kind, a love that confronted sin while embracing the sinner, a love that endured rejection without retaliating, a love that gave and gave until it had nothing left but his very life poured out on a cross. That is the standard. And when you measure your life against it, you will see just how far we all have to go. Consider for a moment the people Christ loved. He touched lepers, welcomed children, spoke with outcasts, and forgave adulterers. He wept over Jerusalem even as the city hardened itself against him. He washed the feet of Judas, the very one who would betray him. These are not mere stories. They are glimpses into the nature of divine love. This is love that refuses to be pragmatic, love that is not calculating or selective, love that is indiscriminate in its reach yet discerning in its application of truth. It is selfless to the point of scandal. And that, my friends, is what makes it so offensive to the natural heart. Because our instinct is not to give but to guard. We hoard our time, our attention, our affection, spending it only where we think it will benefit us. We love those who love us back. We forgive those who apologize first. We show kindness when it is convenient. That is not Christlike love. That is simply reciprocity, the way the world operates. Jesus himself said, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? In other words, if our love does not go further than the natural instinct of fallen man, then it is not divine love at all. Now, think of the psychological depth here. True love, the kind Christ embodied, requires the death of self. And this is why so few actually live it out. Because to love in this way is to constantly put the needs of others before your own comfort, to absorb offenses without demanding repayment, to pour yourself out with no guarantee of being poured back into. From a worldly perspective, that sounds like weakness. But from the perspective of God, it is the very strength of heaven invading earth. For only a strong person can forgive when wronged. Only a strong person can endure rejection without bitterness. Only a strong person can keep serving when unnoticed and unthanked. And that strength is not found in ourselves. It is given by the Spirit of God when we submit to Him. There is also a philosophical weight here. To love selflessly is to recognize that people are not means to your ends, but ends in themselves, eternal souls bearing the image of God. Christ never treated people as tools for His mission. They were the mission. Every act of healing, every word of compassion, every sacrifice pointed to the truth that people are not expendable commodities. They matter infinitely. To live like Jesus is to carry that same vision into every interaction. Seeing in each face, whether friend, stranger, or enemy, someone worthy of patience, dignity, and grace. And yet, let us not be naive, such love will hurt. If you live like this, you will be taken advantage of. You will be misunderstood. You will give without being thanked, forgive without being acknowledged, and serve without being repaid. But this is the cost of discipleship. Jesus did not love because it was safe. He loved because it was right. He loved not for what he could gain, but for what he could give. That is the cross-shaped pattern of love. And if we are unwilling to embrace it, then we are not really asking to live like Him at all. So how do we begin? By asking the Father to free us from the tyranny of self. You cannot manufacture this love on your own. It must be birthed in you by the Spirit. Start small. Be patient with the person who frustrates you. Be generous when it costs you. Be kind when no one else notices. Each act is a declaration that your life is not your own, that you belong to the Father, and that His love flows through you. Over time, those small acts form a pattern, and that pattern begins to look like Christ. At the end of the day, living in compassion and selfless love is not optional for the believer. It is the defining mark of discipleship. Jesus said, "By this all men will know you are my disciples, if you love one another, not by our knowledge, not by our eloquence, not even by our moral discipline, but by our love." And if we lack that, then all our claims of following Him ring hollow. So I urge you, when you wake tomorrow, do not merely ask God for strength to endure or wisdom to decide. Ask Him for a heart that loves as Christ loved. Ask Him for the courage to give without expecting, to forgive without hesitation, to serve without recognition. For in loving this way, you will not only reflect the heart of Jesus, you will encounter Him, because to live in His love is to live in His presence. And remember this at the end of your life, the measure will not be how much you accumulated, how many applauded you, or how much power you wielded. The measure will be simple: did you love as Christ loved? That question will remain long after everything else fades. So start answering it now in the way you live today. If obedience is the anchor and love the lifeblood, then humility is the posture that makes both possible. Without humility, obedience becomes prideful legalism and love turns into a subtle form of self-service. But humility, the kind that Jesus lived and breathed, is the soil in which true discipleship grows. When we ask the Father to teach us to live like Jesus, we are asking Him to dismantle the pride that infects every part of our nature and replace it with the quiet strength of humility. The incarnation itself is the greatest act of humility the world has ever seen. The eternal Son of God, the one through whom all things were made, stepped into the limitations of human flesh. He did not cling to His rights. He did not demand recognition. He did not come wrapped in earthly majesty. Instead, He came as a servant. He washed feet. He touched the diseased. He spoke with the lowly. He allowed Himself to be misunderstood, mocked, and condemned. The one who deserved the highest throne chose the lowest position. If you really want to grasp what it means to live like Christ, you must begin there. That humility is perhaps the most misunderstood virtue in our time. We confuse it with insecurity, with thinking poorly of ourselves, with a kind of weak self-effacement. But true humility is not weakness. It is not self-hatred. It is simply seeing yourself as you really are before God. It is the sober recognition that He is everything and we are dust, that all we have is gift, that all our talents, achievements, and even our very breath are borrowed. When that realization grips you, pride cannot survive. Pride thrives on illusion, the illusion that we are self-made, self-sufficient, or deserving. Humility comes when those illusions are shattered and replaced with truth. The psychological depth here is worth considering. Pride isolates. It drives us to compare, to compete, to constantly seek validation. It creates an endless cycle of insecurity and arrogance, two sides of the same coin. Humility, by contrast, liberates. When you no longer feel the need to prove yourself, you are free to serve others without fear. When you no longer cling to your reputation, you are free to speak truth without compromise. When you no longer demand to be seen, you are free to act in hidden faithfulness. Humility heals the restless heart by anchoring it in the reality of God's greatness rather than the shifting opinions of men. Think of how Jesus lived this out in practical terms. He could have demanded honor wherever He went, but instead He welcomed children onto His lap. He dined with tax collectors. He engaged the Samaritan woman at the well. He treated the least significant people with the same dignity as those of influence. And in the most staggering act of all, He knelt to wash His disciples' feet, even the feet of the one who would betray Him. That image should never leave us. The Son of God, with all authority in heaven and earth, kneeling with a towel and basin, doing the work of the lowest servant. That is not just a story to admire, it is a model to follow. But here is the danger. Even our pursuit of humility can become tainted with pride. We can pride ourselves on being humble. We can parade our lowliness as if it were an achievement. That is not humility. It is pride wearing a mask. True humility is not something you can perform. It is something the Spirit forms in you when you truly encounter God. When Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up, his immediate cry was not self-congratulation, but "Woe is me, for I am undone." In the presence of God, pride dissolves and humility is born. Living humbly does not mean denying the gifts God has given you. It means using them as they were meant to be used. Not to elevate yourself, but to serve. If He has given you wisdom, speak it with grace. If He has given you resources, use them generously. If He has given you influence, wield it for the weak, not for your own advancement. This is the paradox. The more you lower yourself, the more Christ is seen through you. And the more Christ is seen, the more the Father is glorified. Do not underestimate how radical this is. In a world that exalts self-promotion, humility will make you appear weak. But in reality, it is strength under control. It is the strength to refrain when others demand recognition, the strength to remain silent when falsely accused, the strength to serve without applause, the strength to let go of your rights for the sake of others. This is the kind of humility that changes not only individuals but communities, because it dismantles the constant struggle for power and replaces it with a willingness to serve. So ask yourself, do I live with this kind of humility? Or is my life marked by a subtle demand to be noticed, to be respected, to be validated? Do I serve only when it benefits me? Or do I serve because Christ served me first? These questions cut deep, but they are necessary if we are serious about following Him. Because in the end, humility is not optional. It is the unavoidable path of anyone who would live like Christ. Without it, obedience will falter and love will collapse under the weight of self-interest. But with it, obedience becomes joy and love becomes natural. Humility is the quiet posture of a soul that has seen the greatness of God and cannot help but bow low. And so I leave you with this. If you truly want to live like Jesus today, then stop grasping for the throne and pick up the towel. For the way up is down, the path to greatness is service, and the life that stoops lowest is the one that reflects Christ most clearly. If obedience is the anchor, love the lifeblood, and humility the posture, then perseverance is the proof. A life patterned after Jesus is not one that avoids suffering, but one that endures it with faith. This is perhaps the most difficult reality to accept, because every part of our human nature recoils at the thought of pain, rejection, or loss. Yet when we look at Christ, we see that suffering was not a detour from his mission. It was central to it. To live like Jesus is to recognize that trials are not evidence of God's absence, but arenas in which his presence is most deeply revealed. Think of the way Christ persevered. He was misunderstood by his family, rejected by his people, betrayed by his closest friend, abandoned by his followers, and condemned by the very ones he came to save. He endured ridicule, beatings, and the agonies of crucifixion. And yet in all of this, he did not sin, he did not retaliate, he did not curse God. Instead, he entrusted himself fully to the Father. His perseverance was not stoic endurance, but living trust, a confidence that no matter how dark the moment, the Father's will was good and his plan unshakable. Now, let's be honest about ourselves. Our tendency is to equate God's favor with comfort. When life goes smoothly, we feel blessed. When trials come, we feel abandoned. This is a shallow way of thinking, and it cannot hold up under the weight of reality. The world we live in is broken, and suffering is inevitable. If your faith is built only on good days, it will collapse in the storm. The faith of Christ teaches us something stronger, that trials do not diminish our hope, they refine it. Perseverance is not merely gritting your teeth and surviving. It is choosing to believe that God is present and working even when everything you see argues otherwise. Philosophically, suffering confronts us with a deep question: what is the purpose of life? If the goal is comfort, then suffering destroys meaning. But if the goal is conformity to Christ, then suffering becomes a tool of transformation. Scripture tells us that even Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered. That is staggering. The sinless Son of God was shaped by suffering, not because he needed correction, but because obedience is perfected in the fire of trial. And if this was true of him, how much more for us? Trials strip away illusions, exposing whether our trust is truly in God or in our circumstances. Psychologically, perseverance through suffering reorients the heart. Pain has a way of clarifying priorities. What once seemed essential is revealed to be trivial. What once seemed impossible to endure becomes the very place where grace sustains us. Perseverance teaches us that the strength of the Christian life is not found in our own resilience, but in the sustaining power of the Spirit. The one who endures does not do so by sheer willpower, but by a supernatural dependence on the one who never leaves or forsakes. And here lies the paradox. The world looks at suffering as failure, but in the kingdom of God, it is often the stage for greatest victory. The cross is the clearest example. To the eyes of the world, it was defeat, the death of a condemned criminal. But in reality, it was triumph, the redemption of humanity. When you endure hardship with faith, when you refuse to let bitterness or despair take root, you are declaring that the world does not define your story, God does. And that declaration is itself an act of victory. But let's not pretend this is easy. Perseverance hurts. It tests patience, it stretches faith, it exposes weakness. There will be days when you feel like giving up, when prayers feel unanswered, when silence feels unbearable. Those moments are real, and they should not be dismissed. Yet it is precisely in those valleys that perseverance matters most. Anyone can believe on the mountaintop. The question is, will you still believe in the valley? Perseverance is not proven when everything is well, but when everything seems lost and you still cling to him. So how do we live this out? By fixing our eyes where Christ fixed his, on the joy set before him. He endured the cross, despising the shame, because he knew what lay beyond it: the resurrection, the vindication, the eternal glory of the Father. Likewise, we persevere not by denying the pain, but by remembering the promise. Every trial is temporary. Every tear will be wiped away. The weight of suffering is real, but Scripture calls it light and momentary, compared to the eternal weight of glory that is coming. That perspective changes everything. And remember, perseverance is not only for your sake. Your endurance becomes a testimony to others. When the world sees a believer walk through suffering with unshakable faith, they see a glimpse of Christ himself. That is why perseverance matters, not just for your soul, but for your witness. You are proclaiming with your life that Christ is worth more than comfort, more than ease, more than everything this world can give. So do not despise your trials. Do not think of them as wasted. In them, God is at work. He is shaping you, refining you, deepening your faith, and magnifying his strength through your weakness. Your suffering, when endured in faith, becomes a living echo of Christ's own perseverance, a quiet but powerful declaration that you belong to Him. And so I leave you with this: if you would live like Jesus today, then embrace perseverance as the mark of your faith. Endure with trust, walk with hope, and refuse to let trials silence your devotion. For it is in persevering through the fire that the image of Christ is most clearly seen.